Is it the new economy-based toolbox, or are we talking about the new economy-based toolbox? On further thought, I said, well, maybe it doesn't really matter, because it's more or less the answer is the same no matter which question you ask. So today I've been asked to try and cover in these 10 minutes all these issues here, which is going to be challenging, but I'll try and at least touch on each of them. The challenges of the next 2 decades, what I consider, and this has to be a personal perspective, the toughest problem, the toughest instrumental challenge, and the toughest political challenge. And finally, a few words to you about the TEEB toolbox, as it's been referred to. Just imagine me with a sort of plumber's hat and carrying a box. It sounds a bit incongruous, but that's one way of looking at it. I think the toughest problem is connected with the biodiversity challenges. And to me, the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment spells it, because actually it is the enterprise and the environment that we are talking about. How do we bring into the private sector a recognition and an awareness of their impact on the environment? And how do we work with them in order to be able to seek solutions for the future? But it's solutions which will require an impact policy space, which will require an impact administration on the ground, and of course will require deep involvement by the corporate sector itself. So to me, that is the challenge. And how do we address that? Firstly, let's look at the problem itself, and the size is the first thing that strikes you. These are some calculations that were done by a group called TrueCost, which is a research firm operating from the UK and the US, and we published these or referred to these in the TEEB reports as well. If we size the externalities of today's top 3,000 corporations, we come to some rather staggering estimates. And this is a bottom-up calculation that has been done by TrueCost based on its information gathering over the last 10 years. The components of this are not surprising. It is energy, it is manufacturing, it is agriculture, it is all the usual suspects. But what is interesting is that the sheer size and scale. If we look at the externality of $2.1 or $2.2 trillion, which is about 3.5% of global GDP. An interesting facet of this is that it is also 1/3 of the profits of these corporations. So a typical distribution of over 3,000 companies, you'd expect many of those to be in the tail where the externalities exceed their contribution in terms of financial capital. And therein lies the challenge. How do we create recognition amongst the people and amongst corporations themselves that cannot be a sustainable business model? Reading inside the report, you'll find also a statement that this ratio has been increasing with time. And that, again, is a worry, the ratio of the size of externalities versus the profits. To me, the toughest of the instrumental challenges, and I walk away from problem space into solution space, is getting REDD+ right. And to me, the REDD+ is a big solution, because it does incorporate perhaps the fastest climate mitigation together with social as well as ecological solutions. But unfortunately, we are still at an early stage when it comes to working out an agreed structure for the mechanism that will surround REDD+. I think today we have political consensus, which is good, but I think beyond that we need understanding and agreement on how exactly this works. So we are talking about here issues about what kind of regime and offsets in terms of on the buy side for the developed world. Do they have to have markets? Well, how do they become eligible to participate in REDD+? Do they have to have the ability to telescope down their demand, which today may be driven out of a governmental decision or a fund decision, convert their demand into something more sustainable? We have to look at eligibility criteria on the sell side in terms of those who supply these credits. Are there 3 tiers? Is the community involved, and the state and the nation? How are we going to address the other ecosystem services? How are we going to address the whole structure in terms of financing? Because there are years in which rewards have to be paid where performance could be in the community or a state, but maybe not at the nation level. And if you don't reward those, then you will not get private sector committed to a scheme such as that. And finally, the phasing of this whole thing and recognizing that there has to be some degree of consensus building amongst a smaller group. So potentially you are going away from the classical approach of UNFCCC in terms of building outwards from a core group rather than building inwards from an overall consensus. And these are things that these are real, and we have to look at them. Nesting, financing, convergence, and capacity. It's easy enough to say, let's do this, but the reality is that it is difficult to construct and create working projects on the ground. Capacity is a challenge. And finally, also to get away from some of our hang-ups. We keep arguing against what is possible by saying that there is a fungibility issue and saying that there's going to be flooding of credits. And to me, the generation of credits is so challenging. I can't believe how you can flood it. It was so difficult to create them in the first place. And secondly, when we talk about fungibility, let me just point out that I come from the markets world, and at least for the last 33 years, we've been trading in something called the oil markets, two different commodities. There's West Texas Intermediate, and then there's Brent crude. And these are both light sweet crudes, and they both trade at different prices, and there's a spread. And traders who've reported to me have made lots of money trading the spread. And that's been going on for at least 3 decades, and no one seems to have complained about it from the oil community, but I see nothing but complaints about it from the carbon community. How will you solve fungibility? Well, just don't. Don't even think about it. It'll get solved. Yes. So these are some of the challenge issues in red plants. Now I come to what I think you'll find my vote for this a bit strange, because I call this a political challenge. And let me explain why. The challenge is recognizing the importance of ecological infrastructure and recognizing the importance of restoration of ecosystems, partly because they bring adaptation benefits. And here's a quick table for you which summarizes the adaptation benefits. And when I say adaptation, to me it's always adaptation of human communities as climate changes. So we are talking here about the ability to address the challenges of food security, freshwater security, the ravages of storms and cyclones as they grow more intense and frequent with climate change. And then we are looking here at some of these issues, and also, of course, energy security, and how forest restoration, mangrove restoration, wetlands restoration, and even coral reef restoration actually helps in each of these boxes. And you find that many of these boxes are indeed ticked. So if you look at the issue of coral reefs or wetlands, both will increase fish stock supplies, and if you look at mangroves, likewise fish, and forest restoration adds to produce, forest produce. Energy is supported by both forests and mangroves, the fuel wood gathering from these places. So we do have to look at the ecological infrastructure, and interestingly, when a couple of years back the TEEB group did a study which was sadly based on benefits transfer largely, because unfortunately where the costs were available the benefits were not, and where the benefits were worked out the costs were not. So we did some conservative benefits transfer estimates and literally added 20–40% margins on both sides on the costs and the benefits respectively. And yet we got these kind of staggering numbers in terms of social return on investment. To me, the political challenge is, how do we convince governments to recognize this reality, to recognize that ecosystem restoration is a huge potential solution for adaptation, but also all other forms of poverty which I described to you, and to bring themselves to a point where they can invest. And I think that is a key challenge. It is ultimately about spending public money on public wealth. So in theory, there should be nothing to stop governments from doing this. And yet I find this is the biggest stumbling block when it comes around to it. Now, TEEB, as you know, has addressed all of these issues in some form or the other. And we have broken up the TEEB report. Delighted that we have an advisory board member here of TEEB. Herman is very much involved with TEEB and has been on the business side. So we have different focuses of the TEEB perspective for different end users, be they policymakers, local administrators, or businesses. And it's a community which has been working on this. As I said, it's over 60 institutions and over 500 people, be it as authors or reviewers. And we have recommendations which address pretty much all of these spaces, be they in terms of business externalities measurement, to talk about the biggest challenge, or be it the system of national accounts, or be it ecological infrastructure. And I think the key point that we have to, I'll just make one point about the way that TEEB structures itself, is that we look at strategies, we look at valuation firstly as a human institution, and we look at valuation as being available through recognizing value, demonstrating value, or capturing value, and you don't have to look at markets. And we have 5 broad strategies: regional planning, legislation, certification, evaluations of PAs, and payments for ecosystem services. And over 100 examples of these across the various spaces which don't even yet touch markets, as in classical markets, demand-supply driven liquid markets. And there are markets, of course, wetland banking markets and biodiversity markets. But TEEB is about all of the above, not just markets. And these are well documented. These policy solutions are well documented on our environmental atlas by the EEA. There's over 100 of them. And I'd advise that those of you who are interested to see how we attack the issues, look at the write-ups that are there on this website. You can go into various levels of detail. You just look at the top level or the 2-page write-up. So we have addressed this for the purpose of others to follow. And also we have a kind of standard approach which we advocate, which has been applied, a sort of structured approach towards assessment. which has been applied as widely as Germany and Indonesia, and in fact based on some of the ongoing work that is being done here. So we do suggest that these are techniques which certainly will help go ahead with solving some of the problems and challenges I mentioned. Thank you.